The first snows of winter had come early that year, blanketing the vast, unforgiving plains in a shroud of white. Christmas was only a few weeks away, a fact that brought most folks a sense of cheer and community, but for Arthur, it was merely a marker of another season passing in solitude. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, howled around the corners of his small, sturdy house, rattling the window panes and piling drifts against the barn doors. At 30, he was a man shaped by silence and loss, his quiet nature a reflection of the sprawling, empty land he called home. His life was a metronome of routine: rise before dawn, tend the livestock, mend what was broken, and sit by the fire as dusk consumed the sky. It was a simple, lonely existence, one he had accepted long ago. Dawn rose slowly, a pale, hesitant light that did little to warm the frozen world. The sun, a distant, silver disk, seemed reluctant to disturb the profound silence that held the land captive. Its first rays slid along the wooden ribs of the old barn, catching the frost that glittered on every surface and touching the dust motes drifting like tiny ghosts in the frigid air. Beneath a mound of dry, brittle hay, a young Chinese woman breathed in shallow, frightened tremors. Her name was Mai, and she was only 19, though the hardship she had endured had aged the look in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. She had walked farther than her body should have allowed, fleeing the grime and cruelty of the railroad town 2 days east. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, a deep, gnawing ache in her bones that was as relentless as the biting cold. She had arrived in this country on a promise of a new life, only to find herself sold into indentured servitude, her days spent in the suffocating heat of a laundry, her nights filled with the leering threats of the man who held her contract. 3 nights earlier, he had tried to claim more than just her labor. She had fought back, a desperate, wild thing, and then she had run. She ran with nothing but the thin cotton clothes on her back and the burning memory of her sister being taken away to a different town months before. The desire to find her, to not be alone in this hostile land, was the only thing that had kept her moving. As she wandered across the plains, the immense, snow-covered emptiness had settled into her bones like winter itself. The barn had appeared through the swirling snow like an undeserved mercy, a dark shape against the endless white. Wooden beams, the scent of hay, a roof that whispered the possibility of safety. She had crawled inside, burrowing into the hay, and let the darkness cradle her. She expected to sleep until hunger or the freezing cold forced her awake. She did not expect footsteps. Arthur entered at first light, his boots brushing the ground with calm, familiar purpose. The cold stung his cheeks, and his breath plumed in front of him. He came looking for a new calf, born in the night, not a wounded soul hidden beneath his hay. He moved through the familiar space, his senses attuned to the soft lowing of the cattle and the rustle of the horses. Then he saw it, a disturbance in the hay pile, a slight mound that was out of place. He approached cautiously, thinking it a stray dog or a coyote seeking shelter. When he spotted the edge of a dark, patterned sleeve and a shock of black hair, he froze. It was not fear that held him, but a quiet, profound recognition of suffering. He knelt, and the movement caused the hay to shift. Mai lifted her head, her dark eyes fierce and wide with terror, though her body trembled uncontrollably. She braced for the shouting, for the rough hands, for the same violence she had fled. She had seen the way men in this country looked at her, with a mixture of contempt and a cruel, possessive curiosity. She expected the worst. Instead, the rancher knelt slowly, as careful as the hesitant dawn. His face was weathered, his eyes a calm, steady blue. They held no malice, only a quiet surprise and a deep, unsettling well of empathy. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a whisper, as if he were trying not to spook a frightened colt. "Pack your things. You're coming home with me." The words struck harder than any blow. She stared, unable to process them, unable to trust them. Kindness had never been offered to her here, it was a currency she did not possess and could not comprehend. Cruelty she understood. Brutality was familiar. This quiet compassion, she feared. Through chapped lips, she whispered the only English word she could summon, a phrase learned in desperation. "No have. Nothing." He nodded as though expecting it. He saw the tattered edges of her thin tunic, the inadequate shoes that had all but fallen apart. He extended a hand halfway, a gesture of aid, then seemed to think better of it and let it settle on his knee, offering without insisting, giving her the space to make her own choice. When she rose, it was a slow, shaky process. Every muscle screamed in protest. He kept a respectful distance as he led her out of the barn and into the stark, cool morning. The cold hit her with the force of a physical blow, and a violent shiver racked her small frame. Without a word, he took off his own thick sheepskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was surprising, and the lingering warmth from his body was a shock to her frozen skin. She followed several steps behind him, not from distrust, but from the cautious, ingrained instinct of someone who had survived too much. The sky stretched pale and wide above them, a canvas of grey and white, and for the first time in days, huddled in the stranger's coat, she felt less terrifyingly alone under its immensity. His house stood a short walk from the barn, its porch wrapped in quiet stillness, a thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He opened the door and stepped aside, holding it for her. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the rough-hewn wooden frame as though testing its reality. Inside, the air was a revelation. It smelled of cedarwood, baking bread, and coffee. A lamp burned in the corner, casting a soft, amber glow that felt like a sanctuary. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within it, radiating a heat that seemed to thaw the ice in her veins. He guided her wordlessly toward a worn armchair near the hearth, his movement slow and deliberate, as though he feared startling her. He disappeared into the small kitchen area and returned with a steaming tin cup of water, which he gently pressed into her hands. Then he set a plate of food on the small table beside the chair. Cornbread, a bowl of thick bean stew, and a piece of dried meat. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She tried to hide it, to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Eat if you want," he murmured, and then he turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire, granting her the privacy to eat without feeling watched. She ate slowly at first, then with a growing, desperate hunger. The warmth of the stew spread through her limbs like a timid, unfamiliar hope. She glanced at him. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders outlined by the pale light, his hands resting loosely on the sill as he watched the snow begin to fall again, his gaze fixed on the open land. Loneliness rested on him like an old, comfortable coat. When she finished, she set the plate aside. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Why? Help me." He didn't turn around for a long moment. He seemed to be weighing his words, or perhaps the truth behind them. "Nobody deserves to be cold and alone," he said simply. The answer unsettled her, loosening something tight and painful inside her chest. She had expected questions, suspicion, conditions. She had expected him to demand something in return for his charity. Instead, she found a man who offered gentleness without demand, a quiet space without expectation. It terrified her. And it soothed her in a way she hadn't felt since before she'd crossed the ocean. He showed her to a small guest room, barely more than a closet with a narrow bed. But the bed had a thick quilt, and the room was clean and warm. He lit a small lamp on the hallway table, saying softly, "This will help. If you wake at night." She lay down carefully on the bed, still wearing his heavy coat over her damp clothes. Sleep, which had been a fitful, fear-plagued thing for so long, tugged at her immediately. For the first time in what felt like years, she surrendered to it without fear. Outside, the winter wind whispered promises she didn't dare believe. In the hallway, Arthur paused, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing. It surprised him that her presence, this complete stranger in his home, felt less like an intrusion and more like the first, tentative stir of something that had long been missing from his quiet life. When dawn returned, painting the snow-covered world in hues of soft pink and grey, Mai opened her eyes slowly. A sense of peace settled over her, unfamiliar yet gentle. She did not know if she belonged here, or if belonging was even possible for someone like her, an exile adrift in a foreign land. But she sensed with a startling, unnerving clarity that her life had fundamentally shifted the moment he had spoken those impossible words in the barn. The next few days passed in a quiet, fragile rhythm. Arthur moved with a calm, unobtrusive grace, never crowding her, never demanding anything. He would leave food on the table for her, keep the fire roaring, and then disappear for hours to tend to his work on the ranch. He found a set of his late mother's clothes packed away in a trunk, a simple wool dress and a thick shawl, and left them folded on the chair outside her room. They were too large for her, but they were warm and clean. Mai, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of silence and fear. She could not bear to be idle, to accept charity without offering something in return. She mended a tear in his work shirt with small, precise stitches that spoke of years of practice. She swept the floors and took over the simple cooking, learning to use the unfamiliar ingredients she found in his pantry. They communicated mostly through gestures and single words. He taught her the water, fire, and warmth. She pointed to herself and said, "Mai." He pointed to himself and replied, "Arthur." One evening, he found her sitting by the fire, her hands busy polishing a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb. It was the only possession she had managed to keep. He sat in his usual chair across from her, not speaking, simply sharing the quiet space. "My father," she said softly, holding up the bird. The English was broken, pieced together. "He make. For me. For good luck." Arthur nodded, understanding more from her tone than her words. "It's beautiful." A fragile bridge was being built between them, woven from shared silence, small acts of service, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual loneliness. A week after her arrival, the sky turned a menacing, bruised purple. The wind died down to an eerie stillness, and the air grew heavy. Arthur came in from the barn, his face grim. "Big storm coming," he said, his voice low and serious. "A blizzard. We need to check the latches on the barn." He found her sitting near the corral fence long after the light had thinned into a deep blue dusk. The earth was cooling rapidly, the air sharpening, and the storm was building on the far horizon like a vast, dark animal breathing in its sleep. She didn't move when he approached, her posture carved from a discipline born of hardship. Yet something in her shoulders sagged, as if a weight she refused to name was pressing her forward. He stopped a few paces behind her, boots crunching softly in the snow, careful not to intrude more than he already had simply by existing in her line of sight. "You should be inside before the storm breaks," he said. His voice was quiet, an invitation, not a command. She kept looking ahead at the roiling clouds. "Storms don't frighten me." "I know," he replied. "But you're still healing, whether you want to admit it or not." She stiffened. The reaction was small, almost invisible, but he noticed. He had come to notice everything about her, from the defensive tension she carried like armor to the deep, flickering grief that surfaced in her eyes whenever she thought no one was watching. Her pride was not a brittle thing, it was tempered steel, forged in the fires of losing far more than she had ever received. But even steel had its limits when exhaustion and sorrow wounded themselves into the bones. The wind shifted, and a spiral of snow danced above them. The clouds gathered, dark and restless. She rose slowly, as if the movement itself had a cost. "If you think saving me gives you the right to measure my strength, you're mistaken." "I didn't save you," he answered, his voice even. "I just happened to be the one who found you." She finally turned. Her sharp, assessing eyes, trained by survival to mistrust softness, rested on his face. He was a quiet man, with the calm, steady presence of someone who had lived long in silence. He didn't crowd her. He didn't try to tame her wild, wounded spirit. He simply stood still, offering her something men had rarely offered her, stillness without expectation. "You think too kindly," she said, though the words carried less heat than she intended. "Most men take credit for what fate has done." He shrugged slightly, a small, unassuming gesture. "Then I'll take none." A flicker of confusion crossed her features, as if she couldn't decide whether he was mocking her or genuinely meant it. She studied him again, slower this time. Her breath eased a little, though she masked it quickly. The wind rose again, colder now, rattling the corral gate. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. A distant rumble echoed across the plains. He glanced toward the barn. "Storm's closer than it looks." "And you're still standing here," she replied. "So are you." They shared a brief, taut silence, suspended between them like a thin ridge they hadn't yet chosen to cross. She looked away first, not out of dismissal, but out of a deep, weary uncertainty. He stepped back, giving her space. "Come inside before the lightning starts." When he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. It wasn't sharp this time, but rough around the edges, scraped by something she had kept hidden. "Why don't you ask?" He paused, his back still to her. "Ask what?" "Why I was out there. Why I ran." He faced her again, but his expression stayed unchanged. "If you wanted to tell me, you would." She blinked, taken aback by the simple truth of his words. "You aren't curious." "Of course I'm curious," he said, his gaze direct and honest. "But my curiosity isn't more important than what someone's ready to share." The answer unsettled her in a way threats never could. Honesty was a blade she understood, gentleness was a language she was only just beginning to learn. Lightning pulsed along the distant clouds like veins of fire. She drew a shaky breath. "My family. Sold. To pay debt. My sister and I, we came to America. They said we work, send money home." But it was a lie. Her voice was low, heavy with the weight of her story. "They separated us. I was sent to a laundry in the railroad town. The owner, he was a cruel man. He said he owned me. My sister, Lynn, she was sent away. I don't know where. I heard whispers, a mining camp to the west. I had to find her. I could not leave her alone." Her jaw clenched. "That night, he tried to. I fought him, and I ran. I thought if I could get away, if I could just walk far enough, maybe I could find her. So she wouldn't be alone in the dark." He didn't speak at first. The silence wasn't judgmental or heavy with pity. It was patient, giving her story the space it deserved. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The simple, unadorned word struck her harder than any expression of pity could have. She looked away again, but this time it wasn't to hide anger. A low crack of thunder boomed, much closer now. A flash of lightning tore open the sky, illuminating the stark landscape for a brutal, beautiful second. He assessed the sky once more. "We need to get inside. Now." She nodded once, almost reluctantly, but followed him toward the barn. The wind was fierce by then, a physical force moving hard across the open land, driving the snow horizontally. They reached the heavy barn doors just as the first sheet of cold rain and sleet slammed down. Inside, the dimness smelled of hay, leather, and the faint, metallic tang of the storm. The barn trembled with each powerful gust. The horses huffed anxiously, their hooves scraping against the wooden floor. Arthur moved quickly, checking the latches on the doors and windows. "This roof holds, but the wind's serious. Stay near the center." She stood near the stalls, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "You aren't afraid?" It was a statement, not a question. He shook his head as he secured the last latch. "Fear isn't useful right now." She watched him as thunder cracked directly overhead, the sound so loud it shook the very foundations of the barn. His composure wasn't bravado. It was lived experience shaped by solitude and survival, the same elements that had shaped her. But in him, it had settled differently. He was quiet, not because he was hiding things, but because he weighed them carefully. The storm intensified, its fury unleashed. Rain and sleet hammered the roof in furious, deafening waves. Lightning illuminated the barn's interior in violent, strobing flashes. A sudden, explosive burst of wind tore at the main doors, ripping one of the heavy iron hinges halfway loose from the frame. The door swung inward with a groaning shriek of tortured wood and metal. Mai lunged first, her survival instincts taking over. She grabbed the splintered edge of the swinging door, her boot sliding against the slick, hay-strewn floor as the wind tried to rip it from her grasp. Arthur joined her instantly, bracing his considerable weight against the bucking wood. The storm roared, pulling at them like a living, malevolent force. "Let go," he shouted over the din. "It could tear your arm off." She tightened her grip, her jaw set in a line of pure defiance. If it breaks open, the horses will bolt into the storm. Their eyes locked through the chaos, a shared understanding passing between them in that frantic moment. Both refused to yield. Together, they forced the door shut, muscles straining, lungs burning. With a final, desperate shove, Arthur managed to drive the heavy wooden crossbar into place with a sharp, decisive motion. They stumbled back, breathing hard, leaning against the now secure door. The barn shuddered but held. Slowly, the storm's unholy rage shifted to a steady, pulsing rhythm around them, its immediate threat contained. Mai exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "You didn't have to hold it with me," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. He looked at her, his expression serious in the dim, flickering lantern light. "I wasn't going to let you take that risk alone." She studied him, something fundamental shifting under her guarded stare. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of its shape. Outside, the storm still raged, a wild and untamed thing. But inside the sanctuary of the old barn, something steadier, quieter, and infinitely more powerful had taken root between them. Small, yet undeniable. A fragile shelter built not of wood and nails, but of shared struggle and a quiet, unexpected kindness.